now. So in the COVID crisis, first of all, what language you use really, really matters. The very interesting piece in The Spectator by my friend Paul Dolan, who's a proper behavioural economist at the LSE, saying what would have happened if the first country to be infected was Sweden rather than China. Because there was a huge path dependency in the issue, which is because the Chinese, because they can, intervened with complete lockdown, every other country then felt obliged to adopt policies which were at least as stringent. Whereas if Sweden, if we'd had the outbreak from some dodgy Gravidlax and the whole thing had started, you know, from a wet market in Malmo, okay, the entire path of government action might have been completely different. That's a thing called defensive decision-making, often written about by someone called Gerd Gigerenzer, which is a large part of behavior is driven by not actually, fear of blame becomes an absolutely massive problem in public decision-making or institutional decision-making. In a sense, you'd rather make a bad decision which absolved you from blame. This happens in medicine as well, by the way. Doctors over-prescribe interventions because you can get sued for doing nothing, but you can't get sued for doing something. And it's an interesting question. In terms of one thing about COVID, I would have said, is that it's not the job of behavioral scientists to decide what the behavior is. That's the job of epidemiologists. But then knowing what the behavior is, it's our job to design how you might achieve it. And, you know, one thing I would say where we could be useful is that binary rules tend to be easier to police. They arouse more social conformity, particularly if they're visible when they're broken, than rules of degree. So generally, rules, if you want to have a high degree of conformity, it has to be visible when they're breaking, when someone's breaking them, and you have to feel that you're crossing a line. Now, this is why calorie counting may be less effective than fasting. You feel much worse going through a red traffic light than you do breaking a speed limit, if you like. So there's a whole element of behavioral design there. One thing I do feel strongly is that we had no choice but to intervene at an extreme level simply because we didn't know enough to do anything else. And one thing that alarmed me, I think, and I'm straying into kind of data analysis arguments here, what people seem to be doing is they seem to be developing models around the information they happen to have to hand, rather than asking the question first, what do we need to know first? And it struck me there are a whole load of things we didn't know about the thing. R is an average, okay? Once you have R, the only way you can intervene is to everybody. Because if you want to affect an average metric, you can't have targeted interventions because you don't know how to target them.
But there are many R's. There are R's in care homes. R's.
Well, this is exactly it. And actually, R is probably very Pareto, okay? It's kind of 80-20. That actually 80% or 90% of transmission probably happens in 7% of locations. Can I tell a Pareto gag?
Go for it.
So Wilfredo Pareto, who's the Italian economist who is often credited with coming up with the 80-20 rule, that in any complex system, 80% of something is accounted by 20% of something else. Okay. He actually ended up his life in a Swiss chalet with 20 Persian cats. And my assumption is he started off with 100 cats and decided that the best 20 cats gave him 80% of the pleasure. But I don't know what happened to the other 80 cats. Anyway.
Let's not speculate about
that. We'll have to speculate about that one. But actually, if you'd known what the variance of R was, and track and trace makes that possible, if you'd actually inquired also a question which I don't think was ever asked, is the severity of the disease affected by the scale of the initial dose? Which seems to be plausible, but also nearly all models assumed this was binary. You know, it wasn't a case of you could get infected badly or you could get infected, you know, relatively harmlessly. It was assumed to be this binary model, which strikes me as pretty unsafe. And so one of the things I would have said is, look, actually, if you want us to be really intelligent about this in behavioral science, we need to know more. You know, at the very least, you need to be conducting. There were a few things like a cruise ship, which did provide a bit of control group information, but we need to be creating groups from which we derive this information. and you know, if we'd known earlier on that very little, don't quote me on this because it's not yet certain, but it may be the case that very little infection, cross-infection takes place out of doors, for example. Well, outdoor construction work, provided that builders can, you know, resist their terrible habit of kissing on the lips every time they meet each other, which, you know, is terrible. You know, builders are so known for
Those
that.
kind of clubs as well.
Yeah, exactly. You know, could have actually proceeded, but we didn't know what we needed to know. So now, intriguingly, for all the flack that behavioural science got, the only solutions that the entire scientific establishment could come up with were behavioural. And they were: stay indoors as much as possible, wash your hands, keep your distance.